The first night I realized my life was about to unravel started innocuously. The kind of quiet night that makes you think everything is normal until it's far too late to pretend it is, and it began with my teeth, or rather, the absence of them. Wisdom teeth removed late in life after years of neglect, leaving me in a state of constant, gnawing pain that no sound sleep could soothe. A throbbing ache so persistent that I constructed a strict cycle of medicated vigilance, waking every 3 hours. The sharp taste of pills on my tongue, swallowing them as if the act alone could keep the world at bay, my body slowly adapting to a rhythm of sleep fragmented into cruelly short increments until I barely recognized myself in the mirror, pale, hollow-eyed, the lines of exhaustion cutting deep into my face as though some invisible hand was carving away at my humanity. And it was during this week, in that fragile state between delirium and wakefulness, that I first noticed the sound. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a scratching, dragging sound that seemed impossibly deliberate, as though someone or something were scuttling across the shingles of the roof above my bedroom. A noise I initially dismissed as raccoons or possums, the familiar predators of the woods behind our home, until it shifted, moving with a careful, unnatural intelligence, climbing from the back roofline to the front, the sound of its claws against the shingles unervingly precise, like someone testing the limits of gravity, and I found myself unable to remain in bed, compelled by a mixture of fear and instinct to grab the heavy flashlight from the garage, the cold metal shaking in my hand as I stepped outside, the night air thick, suffocating, heavy with the smell of damp earth and the faintly metallic tang of my own fear, my flashlight slicing across the roof in frantic sweeps, each shadow threatening to reveal something worse than the raccoons I hoped it was, until I saw it, frozen in the beam. A naked man, impossibly pale, standing on the sloped shingles, his posture still, almost statuesque, a living monument to terror, and I screamed before my mind could stop me, the sound ripping through the quiet, and he moved, fast, unbelievably fast for someone human, running across the roof with the ease of a predator born to the night, and instinct overrode reason as I ran around the house, screaming for my father, the words choking in my throat, my heart hammering as if it were trying to escape my chest, reaching the back of the house just as the man jumped, the concrete beneath him echoing like a cannon blast, and I froze, horrified at the impossible, the fact that he landed without the sound of bones breaking, and before I could process it, he charged me, tackling me to the ground, clawing, spitting, tearing, the taste of blood thick in my mouth, pain slicing through every nerve, my mind screaming that this could not be real, and yet it was, until my father appeared, flinging himself onto the thing with the kind of force only a parent can summon when a child is in danger, pulling, wrestling, shouting, a chorus of chaos against the dark, and the man broke free, scaling the fence, disappearing into the forest as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the metallic tang of blood in the air, the night settling like a blanket of dread over the house, my body trembling uncontrollably, my father swearing, and me realizing that despite his intervention, nothing would ever be the same, that my perception of safety, of normalcy, had been irreversibly shattered. The following days a haze of hospital visits, police reports, and endless questions with no answers, the police unable to explain how a naked man had appeared on the roof, assaulted me, and vanished without a trace, my mother inconsolable, my father silently furious, and I, left with a mind that could not rest, replaying the event over and over, imagining what might have happened if he had succeeded, and months later, even after the physical wounds healed, the psychological ones remained, a gnawing, constant anxiety that woke me in the night, every unexplained sound, every brush against a window or a creak in the floorboard sending my heart racing, a cold sweat coating my skin, the shadows in my house no longer my own, and it was only a few months later, during a quiet summer when my parents were out of town and my girlfriend slept over, that I realized the terror had returned, subtle, insidious, beginning with the simple sound of trash cans shifting in the driveway, a noise I initially attributed to wind or animals, but when I stepped outside with my flashlight, the cans overturned, their contents strewn across the concrete, the night air still and oppressive, the shadows too thick, the silence following the noise heavier than the sound itself, and then the tapping began, metal against glass, gentle, deliberate, unervingly patient, the kind of sound that makes the mind race before the body has any chance to react. And when I looked out the window, I saw him, or someone, some shape, a figure standing at the front door with his back to me, tapping, waiting, intelligent, calculated, and when he turned, I ducked instinctively, my pulse deafening, the face inches from the window, skin shriveled, grotesque, human yet not, and I screamed, the sound cutting through the darkness, my girlfriend clutching me, terrified, unable to comprehend fully what she saw, while I scrambled to lock the door, to call the police, to convince myself that I had not imagined it, yet knowing deep down that whatever had been outside my window was not only real but patient, intelligent, and persistent, because in the days since, in the quiet hours between sleep and waking, I hear him again, scratching, tapping, moving with the same rhythm, the same timing every 3 hours, as though he knows my schedule, as though he has learned me, and I have realized that some things are not random, some things are deliberate, some things do not rest, and now, even as I tell this story, even as I try to convince myself that the worst is over, I feel the hair on my neck prickling, the shadows in my room pressing closer, the window slightly ajar, the night air carrying the faintest sound of nails on shingles, a sound I know all too well. And I know in the deepest part of my mind that it is only a matter of time before the next encounter, the next unspeakable event, and I lie awake, exhausted, terrified, knowing that freedom, security, and peace are illusions, that I have become prey, that my house is no longer mine, and that whatever waits outside my window, in the dark, watching, is patient, and it is waiting. The days after that night blurred into a relentless haze of anxiety and exhaustion, my mind trapped in an endless loop of anticipation and dread, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees outside my window becoming an alarm signal, and yet life insisted on continuing with a cruel pretense of normalcy, forcing me to function at work, to eat, to interact, all while knowing that when the sun fell and the night pressed in, the terror would return, and it did, subtle, at first, almost playful in its cruelty, with noises outside the window too faint to pinpoint but unmistakably deliberate, scratches along the siding, shadows flitting across the edges of vision, the faint sound of dragging that would stop when I focused on it and resume when I tried to ignore it, until I began to notice patterns, rhythms, the timing of it so precise that I realized it was no animal, no random intruder, but a presence studying me, calculating, testing the boundaries of my perception and patience, and my sleep, already shattered by my recovery from the dental surgery, became non-existent, the cycles of 3 hours awake and 3 hours medicated sleep collapsing into nights of wakefulness punctuated by the occasional unconscious nod of exhaustion, and I began to see him in my dreams, not the grotesque face at the window, but shadowed, featureless, looming over me, sometimes whispering unintelligible words that burned into my memory with a clarity that made my waking moments almost unbearable, until one night the sounds became tangible, unmistakable, the scraping of nails on the siding, the soft thud of bare feet on the concrete, slow, deliberate, and I realized with a surge of cold panic that he was no longer content to lurk at a distance. He had entered the perimeter of my home, testing the boundaries, and I armed myself with anything I could find, kitchen knives, a baseball bat, heavy flashlights, each one trembling in my grip as I crept through the house, eyes darting to every dark corner, ears straining for the faintest hint of movement, and the fear was almost paralyzing, a viscous, suffocating weight that pressed on my chest, making it difficult to breathe, until I heard it, the sound of breathing, shallow, deliberate, close, and I froze, the realization slamming into me that he was inside, or had been, or was testing the thresholds of entry with some patience beyond comprehension, and my heart hammered, a relentless drum that drowned out all rational thought, my mind flashing to every horror story I'd ever heard, every true crime tale, every warning about the dangers of complacency, and yet I was paralyzed, caught between fear and the need to act, until instinct took over, and I began a methodical sweep of the house, every step measured, every creak of the floorboards amplified into unbearable crescendos in my mind, and I found nothing. No signs of entry, no footprints, no displaced objects, nothing to indicate that anyone had actually set foot inside. Yet the evidence was undeniable, the feeling of eyes on me, the cold dread pressing in from every angle, and I realized that he was teaching me, training me to doubt my own senses, to feel the presence of someone who did not need to be seen, someone who could manipulate perception itself, and nights became a battleground of vigilance and terror, my sleep all but abandoned, my nerves frayed, until one night I awoke to a tapping, slow, deliberate, on my bedroom window, the sound so precise it seemed almost ritualistic, and when I looked, he was there, the same shriveled face, pale and grotesque, eyes locked on mine, and for a moment the world froze, a tableau of horror, and I realized that he was not just outside, he was inside my life, embedded in the fabric of my nightly existence, patient, observing, waiting, and I fled from the window, barricading the door, calling the police, who arrived to find nothing, and the absence of physical evidence became almost more terrifying than the presence, because it proved that this thing, this man, or whatever he was, existed on a plane that did not adhere to normal rules, that he could come and go, appear and disappear at will, and as the weeks wore on, I noticed small signs, subtle, almost imperceptible. Things moved slightly, objects not exactly where I left them, footprints in the soft dirt outside that led nowhere, shadows at the edges of rooms that dissolved when I turned to face them, and I began to question my own sanity, whether it was the fractured sleep schedule, the lingering effects of the pain medication, or something else entirely, because I could not deny the patterns, the consistency of the disturbances, the way they seemed attuned to me, as if he understood my habits, my rhythms, my fears, and one night I discovered him in a new, more terrifying way. He was in my dreams, closer, tactile, whispering directly into my ear with a voice that sounded like my own, but distorted, monstrous, telling me things, predicting things, and I awoke in a cold sweat, shaking uncontrollably. The line between dream and reality blurred to the point that I could no longer trust my own senses, and when I checked the house, everything appeared normal, the shadows receding, the air still, but the terror remained, lingering like a physical presence, and I realized that this was no longer about physical threat alone. It was psychological, a slow, creeping invasion of my mind. My perception, my very identity, and the knowledge that I could not hide, that he was patient and methodical, that he would wait, that he would strike or simply watch, and that I would know it and suffer the anticipation. And so I armed myself not just with weapons but with cameras, locks, alarms, anything that might give me a semblance of control, though deep down I knew it was useless, because his power was not physical, it was something darker, something that thrived in fear, and as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I became a ghost in my own home, moving silently, avoiding windows, peering out only when necessary, checking every shadow, listening to every sound, my pulse a constant reminder that my own body had betrayed me by functioning too well, by alerting me to every imperfection in the environment. And then one night, it escalated further, a crescendo of horror that left me paralyzed, as I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing outside my bedroom window, deliberate, slow, heavy, synchronized with my own heartbeat, and when I finally dared to look, the face was there again, closer than ever, pressed against the glass, twisted, decaying, eyes black, pits of something that defied comprehension, and for the first time I understood that this was not just stalking, this was a hunt, that I was prey in my own home, that my sanctuary had been violated, and the terror I felt was complete, enveloping, consuming, until the world beyond that window ceased to exist, replaced entirely by the presence of the thing outside. And in that moment I knew, with every fiber of my being, that there was no escape, no respite, no moment of safety, only the endless vigilance of the hunted, and the knowledge that when night falls, he will return patiently, deliberately, inevitably, because this is not a man, this is a force, a shadow, a dark reflection of fear made manifest, and I was trapped, in my own house, in my own mind, in my own nightmare, with no end in sight. Be why the time part 3 of this relentless nightmare began. I had long stopped expecting nights to be ordinary, for ordinary no longer existed in my life. The quiet of my modest home transformed into a stage for relentless terror, the shadows shifting at the edges of vision, the slightest sound amplified into a scream in my mind. And it all began one sweltering summer night when the oppressive heat had forced me to open my bedroom window once again, my insomnia gnawing at me, my fractured sleep schedule leaving me exhausted yet hyper-aware, when a sound unlike anything I had heard before cut through the humid darkness. The faint, deliberate scraping of claws along the roof, closer, more measured than before, almost rhythmic, like a metronome, counting down to some unspeakable event, and my blood ran cold, my body frozen as I realized that this time he had escalated his presence, no longer content with prowling the yard, no longer content with haunting my dreams. He was actively infiltrating my life in the most intimate way, and as I watched from behind the curtain, my pulse hammering in my ears, I saw him, the same grotesque, shriveled figure, moving with impossible grace across the shingles, pausing, turning his head as if he knew I was watching, his eyes catching the faint reflection of the moonlight and locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and I wanted to scream, to call for help, but even as I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling uncontrollably, a sudden realization froze me completely. This was no longer about survival alone. This was about control, about fear, about the stripping away of the very fabric of my life until all that remained was the oppressive awareness that someone, or something, could enter my world without consequence, and the thought of it made the hair on my neck stand on end, as if my body were warning me of a danger beyond comprehension. Yet my mind refused to fully accept what was happening, caught between disbelief and the visceral terror of knowing that I could not escape, could not hide, and had no allies in this private war, because even when my parents were home, even when friends visited, the presence never manifested as overtly. It was only when I was alone that the predator revealed himself in full, exploiting my solitude, my vulnerability, my humanity, and the nights became exercises in endurance, my fractured sleep schedule leaving me unable to discern between night and day, the hours blurring into an unending vigil as I moved silently through the house, armed with flashlights, knives, anything that might offer a shred of protection, but none of it mattered, for he existed outside the laws of normality, moving unseen, testing my limits, and I began to notice disturbing patterns, small inconsistencies in my environment that no logical explanation could satisfy. Objects slightly moved, doors that had been locked left ajar, shadows that did not correspond to any light source, sounds that echoed through the house with no origin, and I realized with a creeping horror that he was learning me, studying my habits, probing my reactions, and the thought that I might be entirely at his mercy consumed me, leaving me in a state of constant vigilance that bordered on madness, and one particularly hot night, I was jolted awake not by sound but by a feeling, the palpable sense of someone watching me from the darkness just beyond the room, and I realized with a jolt that he had breached the boundary I had thought was secure, that my carefully locked doors and windows were meaningless to him. And the terror escalated further when I saw a movement in the corner of my vision, a shifting shadow that resolved into a human form, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, and yet unmistakably alive, and I felt an instinctive terror that left me incapable of action, unable even to breathe, as he moved closer, silent, deliberate, his presence a living nightmare, and then, just as I thought I might faint from sheer horror, he was gone, vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only the lingering sense of his malice, and I knew with certainty that this was no accident, no random intrusion, but a stalking of the deepest, darkest kind, a predator aware of my mind as much as my body, and the days that followed were consumed with the aftermath, my thoughts racing, my hands shaking, my pulse unrelenting, and I began to set up cameras, motion detectors, anything that might record or deter him. But even as I did so, I knew that they were futile against an intelligence that did not conform to logic, a presence that could exploit the smallest weakness, a predator that had chosen me, and I began documenting everything, in obsessive detail, not because I expected to find answers, but because the act of recording gave me a semblance of control over the uncontrollable, and in those notes I began to see a pattern, a cycle. The way his appearances coincided with my own periods of fatigue and vulnerability, as if he derived some cruel satisfaction from observing me at my weakest, and one night, driven by a mix of fear and defiance, I confronted him, stepping out onto the porch, flashlight raised, heart hammering. And I saw him again, crouched just at the edge of the yard, the shadows of the night twisting around him like a cloak, his eyes gleaming in the weak moonlight, and for the first time, he spoke, a voice like the rustling of dead leaves, unintelligible yet filled with menace, and I screamed, threw my flashlight at him, and ran back inside, slamming the door and barricading it with whatever I could find. The sound of his movement outside a sinister cadence that echoed through the walls, and I knew then that he was not just a man, not just a trespasser, but something more, something that existed between reality and nightmare, feeding on fear, orchestrating terror with a patience and precision that defied understanding. And I began to notice changes in myself, paranoia seeping into every thought, every glance at a shadow, every unexplained sound sending me into spirals of panic, my fractured sleep schedule making it impossible to recover, until the boundaries between night and day, reality and dream, began to dissolve entirely, and I could no longer trust even my own senses, my own memory, my own perception, and the thought that he was out there, watching, waiting, sometimes appearing just at the edge of visibility, sometimes intruding into dreams, sometimes leaving marks that I could not explain, filled me with a terror so complete that I began to question whether survival was even possible. And in that constant state of dread, I realized that this story was no longer about a single night, or a single intruder, or even a single act of violence. It was about the slow erosion of reality itself, the way fear could warp perception, the way a single malevolent presence could dominate existence entirely. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the only way this would end was by confronting him fully, by facing the darkness on its own terms, because running, hiding, barricading, documenting, it was all temporary, a fleeting illusion of control. And the next night, when the scratching on the roof started again, deliberate and measured, I knew the confrontation was coming, inevitable and final, and the dread that filled me was so complete that I could scarcely breathe. Yet beneath that terror, beneath the nausea and the sweat and the pounding heartbeat, a flicker of resolve began to form, a recognition that if I did not act, the fear would consume me entirely. And so I prepared, armed with every tool I could muster, every weapon, every measure of planning, every ounce of courage left in me, and waited, the night stretching endlessly before me, the air thick with anticipation and heat, the silence broken only by the subtle, horrifying promise that he was there, lurking, patient, unstoppable, and the final confrontation, the culmination of months of terror and stalking, was only hours away, and I had no idea if I would survive it. The night had arrived, heavy and suffocating, the kind of darkness that pressed against your chest and made every breath feel like inhaling shadows, the humid air, clinging to my skin as I paced my bedroom, heart hammering in sync with the distant rustling of leaves outside, knowing full well that he was out there, just beyond the thin barrier of glass and wood, watching, calculating, and I could no longer ignore the inevitability that tonight, somehow, this would end, whether I lived through it or not. I had armed myself with whatever I could muster, a heavy flashlight that could double as a bludgeon, a long metal baseball bat that had been collecting dust in the garage, my father's old hunting knife that had seen more winters than I cared to count, and a small pepper spray, the kind that only provided a brief window of defense, yet together they made me feel marginally more human, marginally more prepared for the impossible. I checked the locks on the windows, each one secure, though I knew they were merely symbolic. He had already proven that barriers meant nothing to him. The scratching started again, slow at first, deliberate, a sinister Morse code of malice that sent ice into my veins, crawling across the shingles above my bedroom like some gigantic, patient spider testing its prey, and I realized that I could hear a faint whisper, too soft to understand, too insidious to ignore, the language of someone, or something, that had existed beyond the normal confines of human morality, speaking directly into my fear, and I felt the compulsion to act, to confront him, even as every rational part of me screamed to run, to hide, to do anything other than step into the unknown. I moved toward the back door, careful, silent, bat in hand, flashlight ready, every creak of the floorboards beneath my bare feet making me flinch as if announcing my presence, but I was already too deep into this ritual of terror to retreat. Months of sleepless nights, half-dreams, hallucinations, and encounters had culminated in this single moment, and I was no longer the man who had quietly tried to rationalize what had happened. I was a man reborn in fear, sharpened by months of psychological siege, and I opened the door into the sweltering night, stepping out onto the porch, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness in a trembling arc, illuminating nothing but the faint outline of the yard, until I saw it, him, standing just at the edge, impossibly still, impossibly patient, his grotesque face partially illuminated, his eyes catching the reflection of my beam and locking with mine, and I felt an instinctive surge of adrenaline, my entire body screaming for flight, yet I stood frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of pure terror, and then he moved, slow at first, deliberate, as if savoring the dread radiating off me, and I struck preemptively, swinging the bat with every ounce of strength I possessed, connecting with a sickening thud that echoed into the night, but he did not fall, did not cry out, only tilted his head as if considering me for the first time as a worthy opponent, and my mind spun, the impossibility of his resilience crashing into my own perception of reality, breaking it, fracturing it, leaving me teetering on the edge of disbelief and horror. I attacked again, wild swings, shouting until my throat burned, striking at the shadows of a man who seemed impervious to pain, and he advanced, closer now, silent between movements, and then, impossibly fast, he lunged, his hand reaching for my face, and I blocked with the bat, the impact rattling through my bones, and I realized, with sick clarity, that brute force alone would not defeat him. I dropped to the ground, rolling sideways to avoid his grasp, and scrambled for the knife, feeling the coarse asphalt under my palms, my skin scraped and bleeding, and the world had narrowed to the single horrifying focus of him, the predator, and me, the desperate, terrified, bleeding prey. I slashed, narrowly missing, the knife whistling through the humid air, and he backed off for the first time, a hesitation that sent a spark of hope through me, yet I knew instinctively it was only temporary. He was testing, calculating, gauging my skill, my resolve, my fear, and I could not afford to falter, for in that instant hesitation meant death. The sounds of the night, the wind, the distant rustling of trees, the occasional creak of my own house, faded into insignificance as the dance of predator and prey consumed every corner of my consciousness. Then he paused, tilting his head, his eyes glowing faintly in the reflection of my flashlight, and I saw it, the first real glimpse of emotion, or something resembling it, curiosity. He was intrigued. He wanted to see how far I would go, how far fear could drive a man, and in that horrifying recognition, I understood something fundamental. He thrived not on violence alone, but on the terror that came before it, on the psychological torment, on the slow erosion of sanity, and I realized with a shiver that this entire ordeal had been designed to break me long before any physical confrontation. Summoning every shred of courage, I lunged forward, knife in hand, screaming with a force born of pure desperation, and I struck, connecting finally, drawing blood, and he recoiled, not in pain, not in fear, but in surprise, the first crack in his otherwise impossible facade, and I pressed the advantage, swinging the bat, stabbing, shouting, moving with a ferocity I had never known, each second stretching into eternity, the air thick with tension, sweat, and the scent of iron, and then, in a moment I can still see as clearly as the night itself, he faltered completely, tripping over a section of uneven ground, and for the first time, he was vulnerable. I struck again, harder, more decisively, and he tumbled, sprawling across the asphalt, and I stared, breathing heavily, knife and bat raised, trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, and for a heartbeat, the world was silent, suspended, and I dared to hope that this nightmare might finally end. But it did not end in the way I expected. He lifted his head, one eye staring at me, a grotesque, horrifyingly human eye, and whispered something, a word or name I could not comprehend, but it resonated with a power that made my blood run cold, and I understood then that he was not a man, not entirely, not something bound by normal human limitations, and even as I felt my courage falter, the first hints of true terror washing over me, he rose to his feet, slow, deliberate, but the spell of momentum had broken, and he stumbled unsteady, for the first time, and I realized that my relentless will, my refusal to submit to the fear, had given me an edge I could not have predicted. I struck again, driving him back, forcing him toward the forest line, and at last he retreated, bounding into the trees, a shadow among shadows, disappearing into the darkness from whence he came, leaving me trembling, bloodied, exhausted, yet alive, and as I sank to the ground, the night air thick around me, I knew that the terror would never truly leave, that the memory of his gaze, the scraping of claws across shingles, the impossible speed and resilience, would haunt me forever. Yet in that darkness, amidst the sweat, blood, and trembling hands, I had found something else, proof that even against the impossible, the relentless, the unholy terror human will could prevail, could endure, could survive, and I rose slowly, knife in hand, flashlight clutched tightly, knowing that the world had changed irrevocably, that nights would never be ordinary, that fear would always linger just beyond the veil of darkness, but also that I had faced the unimaginable and survived, and in that survival there was a small, flickering triumph, fragile yet unbroken, a promise that even in the darkest hours the human spirit, no matter how battered, could stand, fight, and endure, and as dawn finally crept over the horizon, washing the world in the tentative light of a new day, I collapsed in my doorway, heart still hammering, blood still warm on my skin, and for the first time in months allowed myself to breathe, knowing that the battle was over, at least for now, and that even the deepest, most persistent horrors could be confronted and overcome by the sheer force of courage, will, and an unyielding refusal to surrender to the shadows that dwell at the edge of our reality.